Good morning. In the first two lectures of this course, we concerned ourselves with questions about right action. We've been asking, what is the morally right thing to do in various scenarios, and why? Today, I want to shift gears and talk not about the right, but the good. Specifically, we will look at various philosophical accounts of well-being, that is, that which is ultimately good for people, what makes a person's life go well. The question of what well-being consists in is obviously of great independent interest. Since we all have an interest in leading lives that go well for us, it is clearly a good idea to reflect carefully about what such a life might look like. But it is also of great importance to normative ethics, to the study of morally right action. As we've seen, an influential family of ethical views, consequentialism, makes the right an exclusive function of the good. The right action in a given situation is that which will produce the best outcome. And a large part of what makes an outcome good or bad are facts about people's well-being. Indeed, according to utilitarians, the well-being of people and other sentient creatures is all that matters to the goodness of an outcome. So our normative ethical theory will not be complete until we've thought more carefully about well-being. That's what we want to do today. Let me begin with a few remarks on the concept of well-being itself. When we philosophers use the term well-being, what we mean is that which is non-instrumentally or ultimately good for a person, that which makes their life go well for them. Now, there's a technical term in this definition, namely that of non-instrumental goodness. Let's clarify what we mean by that. What is non-instrumentally good for a person is contrasted with that which is only instrumentally good or valuable. As the name suggests, things that are instrumentally good are good as instruments or as means to some end. They help you achieve the ends you have. An example is money. Given the way our society is organized, money can help us achieve our ends. With money, for example, we can pay to satisfy our basic needs for food and shelter, and to purchase various other things we desire. So money is instrumentally valuable for us because it helps us achieve our ends of feeding and housing ourselves and acquiring some of the other things we want. By contrast, most of us believe that it would be a mistake to regard money as valuable in itself. The mere fact of having a lot of money in your bank account, after all, will not by itself make your life go any better. Money is only as valuable as the things we do with it. It is valuable as a means to an end, not as an end in itself. On the other hand, there are some things that we do think are good for us in a non-instrumental or ultimate sense, that is, good for us in themselves. A relatively uncontroversial example is pleasure. It is good for us to experience pleasure, we think, not as a means to some further end, but because pleasure is one of the things that ultimately makes a person's life worthwhile. So, what we're trying to do in developing a theory of well-being is to arrive at a fleshed-out account of what is non-instrumentally good for a person and why. We want to know, what makes a person's life go well? What does well-being consist in? The value of well-being for a person is often referred to as prudential value. Prudential value can be contrasted with other kinds of value, for example, aesthetic or moral value. The beauty of a Rembrandt painting, for instance, is a kind of goodness. But it is not good for the painting that it is beautiful. A painting is not a subject of well-being. What we're talking about when we praise the beauty, say, of Rembrandt's Night Watch, is not prudential but aesthetic value. Likewise, sacrificing my life to save others may have high moral value, but it's at least debatable whether doing what is morally good in these circumstances is also what is best for me. So there's at least a conceptual distinction to be made between moral and prudential value. It is common to distinguish three broad families of theories about well-being. The terms I'm using follow the text by Derek Parfit, which was the first of the assigned readings for today. According to so-called hedonistic theories, well-being consists ultimately in happiness, and what would be best for someone is what makes them happiest. According to so-called desire fulfillment theories, well-being consists in desire satisfaction, and what would be best for someone is what best fulfills their desires. Finally, according to so-called objective list theories, what would be best for someone are the items on some objective list. The list might contain, for example, pleasure, moral goodness, rational activity, the development of your abilities, having children and being a good parent to them, knowledge, and the experience of true beauty. These things are good for you, it is claimed, whether or not they also make you happy, and whether or not they are what you desire. Let us look at these three families of views in turn and examine their strengths and weaknesses. Consider first hedonism. Hedonism, we said, posits that well-being consists simply in happiness. According to classical utilitarianism, happiness has been understood as having a positive balance of pleasure over pain. The greater this net balance, the happier the person. Jeremy Bentham, the father of modern utilitarianism, whom we encountered in our first lecture, writes in his Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, quote, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do." End quote. So, according to hedonism, well-being is essentially experiential. It is a matter of having good or bad mental states. For the hedonist, nothing can be good or bad for a person unless she is consciously aware of it. And what is good or bad for her is the experience or mental state itself. Supporters of hedonism have appealed to some fairly simple arguments in support of their view. To the question, why think that pleasure is good for people, John Stuart Mill gives roughly the following answer in his book, Utilitarianism. What is good for people is tied to what seems good to people, and pleasure does, to most people, seem good. But why think that pleasure is the only good for people, that it is the only thing that has non-instrumental value for people? A common hedonistic answer is, well, how could anything be good for me unless I enjoy it? So perhaps everything that is good for me is ultimately good for me in virtue of the pleasure or enjoyment it gives me. Now, despite its simplicity and its historical pedigree, hedonistic theories of well-being have attracted a variety of criticisms. I want to look at three of them with you, in ascending order of seriousness. The first objection challenges the defender of hedonism on whether there really is a distinctive kind of experience, pleasure, that is common to all things that we call pleasant. Derek Parfit puts this criticism very sharply. He writes, "Compare the pleasure of satisfying an intense thirst or lust, listening to music, solving an intellectual problem, reading a tragedy, and knowing that one's child is happy. These various experiences do not contain any distinctive common quality." According to Parfit, the best response that the hedonist has to this objection is to modify her view. She should give up the idea which Parfit calls simple hedonism, according to which there is a common experiential quality in all things that are pleasant. Instead, the hedonist should embrace what Parfit calls preference hedonism. This is the view that what all pleasures really have in common is not some distinctive experiential quality, but rather their relation to our desires. As Parfit puts it, all pleasures are, when experienced, wanted, and they are better or greater the more they are wanted. Likewise, all pains are, when experienced, unwanted. A second objection to hedonism was made famous by the 19th century Scottish philosopher Thomas Carlyle, who memorably described hedonism as the philosophy of swine. Now, Carlyle wasn't meaning to be gratuitously insulting with this epithet, or at least not just that. His philosophical point was that hedonism implausibly places all pleasures on a par, whether they be the lowest animal pleasures of food or sex, or the highest and most refined pleasures of aesthetic appreciation. Now, As far as Jeremy Bentham was concerned, this criticism was entirely on point. According to Bentham, the quantity of pleasure a person is experiencing can be calculated by a simple formula. The magnitude of a person's pleasure equals the duration times the intensity of the pleasurable experience. The type of pleasure a person is experiencing does not come into the equation. For Bentham, in other words, all pleasures are commensurable. That is, they can be measured on the same scale of value. Bentham summarized his view in a slogan, quote, "If the quantity of pleasure be the same, pushpin," which was a simple children's game in the 19th century, "pushpin is as good as poetry." By contrast, Bentham's student, John Stuart Mill, objected to this purely quantitative conception of well-being. Mill introduced a qualitative distinction and hierarchy between so-called higher and lower pleasures. The pleasure of discussing philosophy, for example, or of reading Shakespeare, Mill thought, is more valuable than any amount of basic animal pleasure. We can see this, Mill suggests, if we note that those who have experienced both types of pleasure and are competent judges will tend to prefer the higher over the lower kind of pleasure. Mill too summarized his view in a pithy slogan: "It is better to be Socrates dissatisfied rather than a pig satisfied." As you can see, pigs loomed pretty large in the imaginary of 19th century British moralists. So who is right in this debate between Bentham on the one hand and Mill and Carlyle on the other? Well, here's a thought experiment that might help us decide the issue. Imagine that you are given the choice of living a very fulfilling human life, rich in friendship, aesthetic appreciation, passionate romance, and so on. Or you could have the life of a barely sentient oyster, which experiences some very low-level sensory pleasure. But here's the catch. If you pick the human life, your life will last 80 years. By contrast, if you pick the life of the oyster, your life can go on for as long as you like, millions, even billions of years if you want. Which of these two lives should you pick? Well, if Bentham is right, shouldn't you go with the latter option? If there's no qualitative distinction between pleasures, then an extremely long oyster life will eventually be better, since it will contain a greater sum total of pleasure, even though these are pleasures of only the most rudimentary kind. And yet, I bet that many of us would choose the human life in preference to an oyster life of any length. If that is the right answer, then perhaps we should side with Mill and Carlyle. Now, these first two objections, while significant, are not necessarily fatal to hedonism. They call perhaps for refinements to the view, not for its wholesale abandonment. By contrast, the third objection, which we'll now look at, strikes right at the heart of hedonism. It challenges its central assumption, namely that well-being and ill-being are essentially a matter of good or bad experiences or mental states. We'll consider two cases which call this into doubt. Let's call the first case the cheating spouse. Imagine that you think you have a happy marriage with a loyal, committed partner. As you look lovingly into their eyes on your 30th wedding anniversary, you think to yourself that one of the greatest achievements of your couple is that you've never, over the long period of your relationship, been unfaithful to one another. What you don't know, and in fact never will know, is that behind your back, your partner is having an affair. In fact, they have been cheating on you for many decades, going back almost to the start of your relationship. Many of your common acquaintances know about your partner's infidelity and talk about you behind your back, but they are too reticent to ever bring this up with you, and their behavior towards you gives no hint that they know. Many people, when they consider this case, have the strong intuition that your partner's infidelity can be bad for you, even if you never find out, and therefore even if it never negatively impacts your conscious experience. Unbeknownst to you, we think, your life is going way worse for you than you realize. Contrary to the common saying, what you don't know can hurt you. What is good or bad for you is not just a matter of conscious experiences. Here's another way to come at the same thought. Suppose that you do learn of your partner's infidelity after almost 30 years of being together. A friend finally plucks up her courage and tells you the ugly truth. You're understandably incredibly upset. But what you're upset about is not the fact that your friend told you about your partner's infidelity and that you're now experiencing this emotional pain. What you're upset about is that your partner was cheating on you in the first place. You're unlikely to say to your friend, "Why, oh why did you have to tell me? My life was going so great up till now." Much more likely you'll say something along the following lines. "Although it hurts like hell, thank you so much for telling me. Now that I know, at least I can leave the bastard and recover something from the wreckage of my life." Let's look at a second problem case for hedonism, namely Robert Nozick's famous experience machine thought experiment from today's second reading. Nozick asks us to imagine a machine that could give us whatever desirable or pleasurable experiences we could want. Neuroscientists have figured out a way to stimulate a person's brain to induce pleasurable experiences that the subject could not distinguish from those he would have had apart from the machine. Nozick then asks, if given the choice, would we prefer the machine to real life, supposing that we could have greater amounts of pleasurable experience by plugging into the machine? Now, if pleasurable experience is the only thing that ultimately matters to how well our lives go, we would have strong self-interested reason to want to hook ourselves up to the experience machine. But in fact, this is not Nozick's reaction to his thought experiment. He himself that he wouldn't plug in, nor he thinks would most of his readers. And this reaction, he believes, is telling. It is evidence of the falsity of hedonism as a theory of well-being. Having a good life, Nozick thinks, is not purely a matter of having pleasant experiences. As he writes, we want to do certain things and not just have the experience of doing them. In the case of certain experiences, it is only because we first want to do the actions that we want the experiences of doing them or thinking we've done them. Consider the example of running a marathon. Now, not that I would know from personal experience, but I'm reliably informed that often running a marathon is not the most pleasant of experiences. In fact, it often kind of sucks. Yet, every year, millions of people around the world run marathons. These people want to run marathons not because the experience of doing so is so especially great. It's the other way around. They want the experience of running a marathon because they want to run a marathon. In other words, they want the achievement of having run 26.21 miles without stopping, having overcome psychological resistance and even physical pain. These problem cases for hedonistic accounts of well-being might push us into the arms of a different theory of well-being. According to so-called desire satisfaction accounts of well-being, what would be best for a person is, roughly speaking, what would best fulfill her desires over the course of her life. Now, the desire satisfaction theory has no problem making sense of our intuitions about both the experience machine and the cheating spouse case. The problem with plugging into the experience machine, according to the desire satisfaction theorist, is that many of our sensual desires are likely to remain unfulfilled. Take your desire to run a marathon. You may believe that this is what you're doing, but in fact it is just a hallucination. And what you want, the argument goes, is to run a marathon, not just the experience of running a marathon. Likewise, the infidelity of your spouse is bad for you, even if you never find out about it, because you have a strong desire that your spouse not cheat on you. And this is being frustrated by their unfaithfulness. Desire satisfaction theories are also popular with economists, since they avoid some of the epistemological problems about interpersonal comparisons of well-being that beset hedonistic views. We can't peer into other people's minds to measure directly how much pleasure they are experiencing and how that compares to the pleasure of other people. But we can observe their behavior, which often gives us clues to their preferences. That is the basis of the theory of revealed preference in microeconomics. Now, the definition of the desire satisfaction theory on the previous slide leaves open a number of questions. First, is any desire you have relevant to your well-being? even if it's a desire, say, for the happiness of a complete stranger unrelated to you? Or must your desire be more closely tied to how your own life goes for it to matter to your well-being? Parfit thinks that the latter option is more plausible. Parfit concedes that events in the lives of other people can matter if they reflect on whether you've succeeded in some of your main goals for your own life, for example, to be a good parent. If your children later turn into failures for reasons that are tied to your parenting, then these facts can mean that your life has gone less well for you. Parfit labels the resulting view the success theory. Second, let us ask, are the desires whose satisfaction or frustration matters your actual desires? Or are they the desires you would have if you were in possession of all the relevant information? Now, I think most desire theorists would question that it necessarily makes your life go better if you get what you want, if what you want is based on serious errors of fact or on incomplete information. What matters is the satisfaction of your informed desires, that is, the desires you would have if you had all the relevant information, not the desires you may actually have. Finally, let us ask, is what matters to how well your life is going how many of your local desires are being satisfied, that is, desires moment to moment? Or are the desires that matter your global desires, that is, desires for how your life as a whole or for how significant chunks of it should go? Parfit gives us a brilliant thought experiment to suggest that the most plausible version of the desire satisfaction theory takes a global, not a local form. He says, imagine that you could start taking a highly addictive drug, which will cause a very strong desire for the drug every morning. Now, taking the drug will give you no pleasure, but not taking it will cause you quite severe symptoms of withdrawal, though taking the drug in itself is harmless. Fortunately, I can guarantee you that there will never be any problem with the availability of the drug. You'll have a secure supply forever, and taking the drug will cost you nothing, neither financially nor in terms of your health. Should you start taking the drug? If what makes our lives go best were maximizing the number of our local desires that are satisfied, you should seriously think about taking the highly addictive drug. After all, think of the amazing opportunity it represents. All these new local desires you could acquire by becoming addicted to the drug, plus the ability to satisfy them. Your life is bound to contain more satisfied desires if you become addicted. But on reflection, however, most of us think that it wouldn't make our lives go better to become addicted to the drug. This suggests that there's something wrong with focusing on local desires. Appealing to global desires avoids this problem. Although becoming addicted to the plentiful drug allows you to have and satisfy many local desires, it is not what you globally desire. Most of us don't want to become addicts, even to a harmless drug. If satisfying your global, not your local desires is what matters, becoming addicted to the drug, therefore, is not better for you. And this, I think, is the intuitively correct result. Desire satisfaction theories of well-being have a number of implications that are worth making explicit because they are philosophically fascinating. First, as we've already noted, because desire satisfaction need not be experienced, this implies that you can be made better or worse off by events that you never experience. That's what allows desire satisfaction theories to give the intuitively correct verdict in the cheating spouse case, which was one of the problem cases for hedonism. Second, and even more interestingly, the desire satisfaction theory implies that you can be made better or worse off by events that occur after your death. Imagine that you're a great architect and your lifelong ambition, your overriding desire in life, is to build a cathedral that will stand for centuries. The cathedral is completed in your lifetime, and you die a happy man. But 2 weeks after your death, the cathedral is destroyed in an earthquake. This is bad for you on the desire satisfaction view, since it frustrates one of your strongest desires in life. Now, that the event which frustrates the desire occurs after you are already dead is neither here nor there. This merely ensures that you don't know about the frustration of your desire. But that, we already said in discussing the cheating spouse case, is no reason for thinking that the frustration of your desire can't be bad for you. What happens after your death can bear on how well your life has gone. Unfortunately, like hedonism, desire satisfaction theories too are vulnerable to a number of objections. First, we may wonder, can desire satisfaction really be all that matters to well-being, even if a person's desires are utterly trivial or even evil? Consider a case from John Rawls. Let's call it the grass counter. So, imagine a brilliant Princeton mathematician with the potential to make really important breakthroughs in applied mathematics, which would benefit many people. But instead, the mathematician develops an overriding desire to count the blades of grass in front of Nassau Hall. Every day he wants to know, is the number of blades of grass on the lawn in front of Nassau Hall odd or even today? So this is how he spends his days, not doing mathematics, but counting the blades of grass. Of course, you have to imagine that this is a mathematician who already has tenure. Now, if by the end of the day he has answered his question, he is content. And let's imagine that he gets really good at this, so that on most days he does satisfy his desire to know whether the number of blades of grass in front of Nassau Hall is odd or even. I think that our reaction to hearing this case is not, what a good life this man is having. Every day he is managing to satisfy his strongest desire, namely to count the blades of grass in front of Nassau Hall. Rather, I think we're inclined to think, what a terrible waste. This man is throwing his life away. This is not a good life to lead. What he desires is utterly trivial and without value. The problem only becomes more acute if the desires in question are not just worthless, but actually evil. Imagine a sadist who has a strong desire to inflict suffering on innocent strangers. And over the course of his long life, he manages to satisfy this desire on many occasions, always remaining undetected. Despite having satisfied many of his strongest desires, I think we may wonder whether this man has really lived a good life, even in purely self-interested terms. So that's the first problem for desire satisfaction theories. A second problem for desire satisfaction theories arises from what welfare economists call the problem of adaptive preferences. The philosophers Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum have also done really important work on this. People often adapt their preferences and desires in light of what they consider feasible. Here's an example. Imagine a woman living in the US in the 19th century. At the outset of her life, the woman has a strong desire for higher education and for active political participation. But her desires for these things are frustrated by the oppressive social conditions in which she lives. Suppose the woman were to lose her desire for higher education and political participation, so that there are in fact no more such desires to frustrate. Would this make things better? That doesn't seem clear at all. Intuitively, avoiding the frustration of desires by lowering one's sights and adopting desires that are easier to satisfy is not always an improvement, even if this means fewer frustrated desires and more fulfilled desires. In raising children, for example, we think it is a good thing to inculcate in them at least a moderate degree of ambition, where I'm understanding ambition as a disposition to have goals or desires that are not easily satisfied. This is so, although being ambitious probably raises the likelihood of future desire frustration. So, all else equal, it would seem much better for the woman to be able to satisfy her desire for political participation and higher education than for her to simply adapt her preferences in light of her restricted options. But desire satisfaction theory can't necessarily tell the difference. Let's look at a third and very important kind of criticism to desire satisfaction theories of well-being. Many philosophers have had the sneaking suspicion that there's something fundamentally wrong with desire satisfaction accounts. According to this line of critique, desire fulfillment theories have got things backwards. They reverse the intuitively correct order of dependence between desire and what is good. In his Metaphysics, Aristotle writes, "Desire is consequent on opinion rather than opinion on desire." Now, what Aristotle means by this somewhat cryptic remark is that in many cases, it seems that we desire certain things, such as writing a great novel, because we think those things are independently good. We do not think that they are good because they will satisfy our desire for them. Now, this criticism of desire satisfaction theories is a nice transition to talking about our third and final theory of well-being, namely so-called objective list theories. According to the objective list theorist, a person's life goes well to the degree that it contains items from an objective list, which may include things like pleasure, moral goodness, rational activity in the development of one's abilities, having children and being a good parent, knowledge, and the awareness of aesthetic beauty. These things are good for a person, it is claimed, whether or not she desires them, and whether or not they make her happy, because they are valuable in themselves. Whereas hedonism and the desire satisfaction theory give an account of self-interest which is purely descriptive and does not appeal to facts about value, the objective list theory appeals directly to what it claims to be facts about value. Now, here's a little exercise for you to do at home. Why don't you take about 10 minutes and think for yourself about whether or not the objective list theory can support the intuitively correct verdict in a number of the cases we've examined today, and which we saw troubled either the hedonistic or the desire satisfaction theories of well-being. Specifically, I want you to ask yourself, how would a proponent of the objective list theory reason about A, Nozick's experience machine case, B, Rawls's grass counter, C, Parfit's case of the undetected sadist, and D, the problem of adaptive preferences discussed by welfare economists? I'll see you on the other side. All right. We've spoken a little about the attractions of the objective list theory. But of course, no philosophical theory is without its detractors, and so I want to end today's lecture by briefly talking about two possible lines of opposition to objective list theories. First, one might wonder, are objective list theories perhaps objectionably authoritarian or paternalist? Aren't they basically giving other people license to force Shakespeare down our throats for our own good? Whether or not this is what we want, and whether or not it gives us any pleasure. I think that to this first objection we can answer with a relatively firm no. I think that accepting an objective list theory of well-being commits you neither to embracing paternalism nor authoritarianism. There are two reasons for this. For one thing, living autonomously, that is, living a self-directed life, may itself be one of the goods on an objective list. So it would be potentially self-undermining to try and force us to engage in certain activities, such as reading Shakespeare, for our own good. Second, and even more importantly, there is simply no inference from the evaluative claim that someone's life goes better for them if it contains items from some objective list, to the moral claim that it would therefore be permissible to force another person to lead such a life. For it may well be wrong to interfere with people in this way, even if this is what would make their life go best. This is in fact close to John Stuart Mill's position in On Liberty, which we will read later this semester. Okay, let's consider a second line of objection. Since objective list theories hold that certain things are good for people independently of their preferences, it might be alleged that such views are elitist. Perhaps such views don't give other people license to force us to engage in certain valuable activities for our own good. Still, isn't the view itself telling us to read poetry rather than play pushpin, whether or not that is what we actually want to do or enjoy? And isn't that pretty elitist? I think that this is a more interesting objection. One possible response to this objection, which Parfit proposes in his text, is to adopt a hybrid view, which combines the objective list theory with preference hedonism. Such a view might hold that, although goods like rational activity or aesthetic contemplation can't be reduced to giving people good experiences, such things may in fact only be good for people when they do, in fact, bring pleasure. But likewise, for the experience of pleasure to have any value, it must be pleasure with a worthy object. As Parfit writes, on this hybrid view, each side in this disagreement saw only half of the truth. Each put forward as sufficient something that was only necessary. Pleasure with many kinds of object has no value. And if they are entirely devoid of pleasure, there is no value in knowledge, rational activity, love, or the awareness of beauty. What is of value, or is good for someone, is to have both, to be engaged in these activities, and to be strongly wanting to be so engaged. Well, that's it for today, folks. I look forward to seeing you next time.